I need to see all of your existing training. So I thought that would buy me some time.
Yeah.
And then they took me on a tour of the building and they showed me all of the training. And I can't tell you that much, but I can tell you two things which I think are interesting. The first thing is they walked me past this room which had the biggest computer I've ever seen in my life inside it. And they were like, this is the original AI, basically. And they told me, which I didn't know, that the US Army was responsible for basically inventing the computer. They designed ENIAC in 1943 during World War II. And so they've had these computers in the basement for forever. And they also invented generative AI and all these kinds of things. And so they had fed this computer with, like the minds of all the smartest generals in history. And it was supposed to be the most brilliant thing in the world. And I said, wow, this is amazing. Is this how you train your students? Do you have them, challenge themselves against this AI? And they're like, no. Turns out actually the computer's pretty dumb. And the more that people train against it, the less intelligent they get. And I was like, oh, okay. So they closed that door. And then they said, here's the room where we really train people. And they opened the door and it was a library. And it was full of books. And there were a lot of sort of interesting books in there. I can't talk too much about them, but one thing I can say about them is a lot of them were near future science fiction. And so basically jumping 2 years into the future. And the idea was that you would read these stories and you would start to imagine, what would I do in these realistic scenarios that haven't actually happened yet? And so I started to realize, actually, a lot of the work they're doing here is kind of literary. It's kind of story-driven.
Right.
And so I was able to kind of tuck in and start sort of training them a little bit in that way.
Wow. Pretty exciting. So he could have written a book about that experience, but no. He took that experience and made it relevant to all of us. In fact, the real breakthrough for me when I started reading this book is that in the past, you've always talked about stories in general, creating stories, who created them, how you might create them, all of these things, what they did to people listening to them and telling them. But then you write, the most important story is the story you think to yourself about yourself. Let's go there.
That's right. That's 100% right. Yeah. So the first thing is we're taught the stories are largely for communicating, but we actually know this isn't true. We know that story evolved in the brain long before language did. It evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. And the reason it evolved in the brain is to allow us to imagine stories of the future so we could change the world. Another word for a story is a plot, is a plan. So really story is the way that our brain plans and imagines alternate futures. And so a big part of what drives our intelligence is our ability to tell these new narratives of the future. But even though those are important, what's most important is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, because it turns out that's what drives our ability to have something called anti-fragility, and also our ability to change the world around us. And so what is anti-fragility? Anti-fragility is the ability to get wiser from grief, from shame, and from negative experiences, and to get smarter from failure. It's the ability, in other words, to grow. And if you have a certain story inside your brain that is a story you tell about yourself, you're able to take all these negative experiences and process them into good experiences. And so what does that primordial story look like? This is something I was fascinated by, and this is something I was able to see. And an interesting point of overlap is that the operators who have anti-fragility are telling themselves the same story as 4-year-olds. And so we were able to kind of align these stories and kind of figure out what they were. So the first thing I want to say is that everyone's story that they tells themselves is a little bit different. We're all unique. There's no hero's journey. There's no archetypal story. There's no universal stories. There's nothing like that. All of us have our own unique stories. But the kind of common characteristic of a story, a personal story that possesses anti-fragility, is an integrated past and a branching future. So it looks a little bit like a trident. So when you think back over your past, everything that's happened to you, you're able to connect it together into one single sense of why. Why is this happening? And that helps you derive your sense of purpose. But when you look out in the future, you're able to see all of these branching possibilities. And what that combination does is it gives you a sense of personal momentum, but also adaptability, also flexibility. So, we're often taught of the importance of things like, grit and perseverance and persistence. And those things are important, but it's also important to be able to change. The question is how do you change without losing yourself? How do you change so you're not just drifting? And the answer is you have that integrated past. What it does is it works for you like water going down a mountain. The more that stream picks up momentum, the more that even when it encounters a rock, it's able to go back on its original course after going around that rock. And so that integrated past branching future allows you to hit obstacles and then return around it and go back to who you are. And so a big part of what we discovered in the book is that operators have this, 4-year-olds have this, but then most people lose it through school and through work because school starts to disaggregate your past and starts to narrow your future. So if you look at most people in business environments, they actually have a fractured past and a narrow future. Like they can only really see one path ahead for themselves. They get very tight. And they look back on their past and they think of themselves as being kind of multiple people, not exactly sure who they are. And that shape is the same shape as a soldier with post-traumatic stress disorder.